subjects, we want to keep in mind that these are just part of it, right? And they all sort of come together. And for what purpose? What's the theme verse in our being a disciple? Anybody remember? Yes, it's right in the center. Let's all turn to it. Matthew chapter 10,
24 and 25.
verse 24 and 25. Turn to it. Let's get back in the groove. And to remember the context of it, beginning in verse 5 all the way through the end of the chapter, Jesus is giving instruction to his disciples before he sends them out 2 by 2.
Yep.
And this is the most, not elaborate, it's not the right word, can't think of the word, but you'll think of it after I say it. Extensive coverage of what he told the disciples that any of the Gospels give. Mark only gives us, a few verses, Luke gives us a few verses, but here in Matthew, of course maybe because he was there.
Yeah.
Mark wasn't there,
No.
Luke wasn't there, but Matthew was, and he gives the most extensive account of what Jesus said to his disciples before he sent them out. Okay? So, right in the middle, almost exactly in the middle, in verse 24 and 25, he expresses to the disciples what we believe is God's ultimate desire, goal, objective, to use worldly terms, for you and me. Okay, so someone read that, please, 24 and 25.
A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for a disciple that he be like his teacher, and a servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they call all those of his household?
And what is it that we want to focus on that expresses God's will for us?
Being like the master.
That's right. It is enough
It's enough.
that we become like our master and like our teacher, right? For sure, I think we all are aware that we're not above and never will be. But his desire is to conform us to the image of Christ. And so as we go through these different characteristics, first of all the ones that we've looked at, and all the ones that we're going to continue to look at, we need to understand that these aren't just characteristics of a disciple. These are characteristics of Christ. Right? Okay. Compassionate. We looked at that last semester. Well, that's a characteristic of Christ, right? Forgiving. That's a characteristic of Christ. And so, if we understand that he is at work in us to conform us to the image of Christ, all these things are not just to be our characteristics, they come from Christ, so that we become like him. And so what we're going to look at tonight is that of understanding, accepting, and submitting to the way of God. Now that's a very broad subject, the way of God, that is, okay? Because God has many different ways of accomplishing this work in us. But we're going to look at maybe just a few things in particular, a few things that most Christians are unaware of, and certainly those who are aware of it don't necessarily care for the way of God. Okay, so once again, we're looking at understanding, accepting, and submitting to the way of God, or God's way. Okay. So let's begin by looking at Isaiah chapter 55. Isaiah 55, and we're going to focus on verses 6 through 11. Very popular verses. I know you're going to recognize these when we get there, but I'm sure that the way that we've thought of these verses were geared towards a particular way. And not that that's wrong, but it's much more than just how we have come to think of it, okay? Isaiah 55, 6 through 11. Candy, you want to start us off? Let's one verse each.
Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near.
Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return unto the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon.
For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord.
For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
For as the rain comes down and the snow from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, and make it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater.
So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper the thing whereto I sent it.
So I think the way most people look at this, and again, not that it's wrong, but in the way that, God's ways are mysterious, right? And they are, for sure. But if you think of the context, well, part of his ways that are high above the heavens and that are not our ways is what we just read in verse 6 and 7. What will he do, as we read, or what does he do in verse 7?
Tells people to repent, or
Yes. And what
essential.
else?
And have
Mercy.
mercy on
And
Yeah. Having mercy.
and abundant.
Abundant. That's
yeah,
right.
he will pardon.
And pardon. That's right. Okay. And that's wonderful. We all are recipients of that and such. And yet we need to realize to whom God was speaking through Isaiah. He was speaking to a rebellious, stubborn people, right? If we're not going to turn there, but back in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, he talks about how the people of Israel were sick from the bottom of their foot to the top of their head. They were worshiping all kinds of idols and such, and yet God would send prophet after prophet, where you and I, if somebody's insistent on messing up, we just forget you, or whatever, right? I mean, that's part of God's ways being so much different than our ways. His ways much higher than our ways, as the heavens are above the earth. And all of that is true, and we're thankful for that. But we also have to keep in mind that God's way of bringing a person to that place, when they're not cooperating, when they're not believing, when they're not submitted to him in his way. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Of course, God does it because he loves us, and he doesn't want us traveling down that wrong road of destruction. But to the and not just the message of the modern church. I think we all, to one extent or another, when God does work his ways in our life, there's sometimes a question that arises in our thinking. Why? Right? We don't understand. We may argue with his way. Because again, we all have, hopefully less and less, our own way of perceiving God. The wrong way. God's correcting that, right? But to correct that, he exercises his way in our life to bring us to that correct understanding. Okay? But certainly in the modern church today, God's made out to be a genie in the sky, just someone ready to grant you your every wish. And I don't want us to be distracted by that, because it's easy to think of the things that are way off, and we lose sight of, well, what is God trying to teach me? right? And that's why I'm saying, you know, even at times in our own life, when God is exercising His way of growing us up, His way of stripping us of our self-reliance and independence and all the things that hinder us from walking close with the Lord, the questions can and do arise, right? Why? I don't see how this is a good plan. I don't understand this, and any number of things. And even in that, God is working through His way to remove that. Remove what? I don't understand. Well, we may never understand. That's maybe not a good term to use. And replace it with what? Faith. To trust. And to know, really know, that what He's doing is good and it's right. Even though we may not understand. All right? So, I'm going to take a few turns here. I want us to look at some examples of times where God's people had a lack of understanding. Again, what are we looking at? We're looking at understanding, accepting, and submitting to God's way. And so what we're looking at right now is some examples in the Bible where there was a lack of understanding, right? And because when there's a lack of understanding, what do you think is going to follow? What are the other two things we're looking at?
We won't submit.
Accepting and
They're not
submitting,
accepting
right?
and they're not
If we don't
submitting.
understand that this is God's way, it's pretty unlikely that we're going to accept it. And the reason many times, again, is because we have our own idea, right? Because we've kind of made God after our own liking. And whatever, I mean, the disciples did that over and over again. And we're His disciples, right? And so just as Jesus, and my goodness, think of, they had Jesus. You have me. You have somebody better than me. You have the Holy Spirit. But still, we have that propensity to hold on to what we're comfortable with. And that's not what we need. So let's turn to Psalm 95. Psalm 95, we're looking at instances, examples of those who lacked understanding, and thus, as they lacked the understanding of God's way, they did not accept nor submit themselves to God's way. So we're going to read the whole chapter. It's just 11 verses. And why don't we take 2 verses each. Sean, why don't you start us off? Psalm 95. And this is one of 3 times that this is referenced in the Bible. We're going to look at another time, and that's in Hebrews chapter 3. And then we're going to look at also at Deuteronomy chapter 8, where God is rehearsing for the children of Israel their recent parents' history, okay, before they come into the promised land. But all of it has to do with understanding what? God's way. And I don't think any of us are prone to accept and submit to God's way when we don't understand it. I mean, not that you're going to fully understand it, right? But to understand that, well, this is how God works. We may not like it, we may not accept it, but to understand that this is one of the ways, one of the methods, if you would, that God works, well, that makes accepting a whole lot easier. Because when God is exercising His way, who's right there to bring us into questioning God's way? The enemy, right? The false teachers.
Yeah.
Well, if God really loved you, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, understanding that this is part of God's way. To accomplish what? To conform us to the image of Christ. Well, we're on the right path. And then we can accept it. And we can submit to it. Right? Okay, so Psalm 95.
O come, let us sing unto the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving and make a joyful noise unto him with psalms.
This one?
Yes.
For the Lord is the great God and the great King above all gods. In his hand are the deep places of the earth. The heights of the hills are his also.
The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker.
For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness. When
I know it's hard to stop.
When your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my work, 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, it is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways.
So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest.
Now it's almost like the first half and the second half don't go together.
Yeah.
But they go together. You see, it's because the children of Israel didn't do what is said in verses 1 through 7a. They didn't acknowledge and recognize and worship him and bow down to him. That as they went through verse 7b through 11, they hardened their hearts. And what stood out to you in regards to the subject that we're looking at tonight? Any verse particular or part of a verse that jumped out at you?
Not to harden your heart.
They shall not,
That's a good one. That's important. But that's not it.
Verse 11.
they shall not enter my rest.
Yeah?
Oh, when they were tested.
No? What's our subject?
God's
His ways.
His ways.
They do
When
not
you see
know
in
his
verse
ways.
11,
Yeah, they do not
they
know
have not known my ways.
ways. Yeah.
That was the problem, the root of the problem. And we're going to see that more clearly as we look at some other scriptures, okay? But, well, why didn't they get into the promised land in the first year? Because they didn't know God's way. They were complaining and they didn't believe God, right? They said, let's send some spies. And so Moses chose 12 men. Caleb and Joshua were 2 of them. And they came back with a great report. But the other 10, but what had God said? He would give them the land, but they didn't believe. Okay? So for 39 more years, they tramped through the wilderness and died. Okay? All right. So with that verse, let's turn to Hebrews chapter 3. And the author of Hebrews is going to quote much of what we just read in Psalm 95. Verses 7 through 11, let's read one verse each. Candy, you start us off, and we'll go to the right.
Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as in the rebellion in the day of trial in the wilderness.
When your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works 40 years.
Are we reading 1 or 2 verses?
One. Candy read 2
Oh,
because
I'm
she just
sorry.
couldn't
Oh,
stop, but
oh,
that's
I thought
okay.
you said
You know
2.
what? She had to read 2 because she only got to read 1 the last
Right.
time. So she
Okay.
made up for that.
Okay. So
10.
Okay. Therefore I was angry with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways.
So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest.
Okay, so,
Same verse as
almost,
in
that's right, he's quoting from
Quoted.
what we just read,
Isaiah.
okay? Now, let's go back to verse 7. And we've looked at this before, I think, as we maybe covered an area of hardening your heart, the dangers of that and such, but you know, as scripture is, it has many things to say to us, not just one thing, okay? And so, here in verse 7, today, right now, and then the word if, right? What does that imply? Either we will or we won't. If we will what?
Hear his voice.
Hear his voice. And whenever God uses the term hear, what is understood? Did I tell you that?
Yeah.
What?
Oh, wait.
Go ahead.
No, I missed.
Obey.
Yeah.
It's not just hear audibly, but whenever God uses the term hear, hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God, and him alone shall you serve. He's not just telling us to auditorily receive it, but obey what we hear.
Obey it.
Okay? So he says, if you will hear his voice, don't do what? Verse 8.
Harden your hearts.
And what he's doing, he's reaching back into time, using their forefathers, because this is 3,000 years later, right? When the author of Hebrews is talking to the Hebrew believers now. Don't harden your hearts. I'm sorry, yes, verse 8. Don't harden your hearts when?
That's in the
In
rebellion.
the day of trial in the wilderness.
Yes, that's
And
very
they would be
important.
really familiar with this.
The day of trial, right? Listen, gang, that's God's way. God's way is to put us through trials. And when we don't understand that, you're not gonna do what? Well, you're not gonna accept God's way, because that's not what you believe God's way is. And you're certainly not gonna submit to it. Because many times, the trial is presumed to be coming from Satan. And so you're taught to rebuke Satan, and so you can continue on the easy path, when it's God is the one that's bringing you the trial. Does that go against your thinking? Yeah. Well, your thinking's wrong. Okay? And you need to correct your thinking, and that's why we're looking at the Word. Okay? And we're going to see through the Scriptures that that's going to be proved over and over again. Right? But continuing on, in this text that we're looking at here, in the provocation, in the testing, in the day of temptation in the wilderness, okay, what did they do? They hardened their heart. Right? Why did they do that? Well, we're going to see it because they didn't believe God and they didn't know God's ways. Okay? Keep that in mind. Mark it down, maybe. And because when we go to Deuteronomy chapter 8, it's going to become so very apparent that this is God's way. Okay? All right, so in verse 9, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and did what? They saw his works. I mean, my goodness. While they were still in Egypt, they saw God bring 10 plagues, and they were protected from them.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were delivered out of Egypt, not as poor paupers, but quite wealthy.
Yes.
Because God put it on the heart of the Egyptians to give them everything. The gold, the silver, and all that they had. Where do you think they got the gold to build the golden calf? Where do you think they got the gold and the silver to do the tabernacle? They had great wealth that God had given them. And then all the other things that happened. We'll get to that in just a moment. But they didn't believe the Lord. Why? Because they had their own idea of how God should act, how God should lead them. And you run into this in the mall, you run into this all the time when you talk to people, no matter where you are. They have their own idea about God.
What God is.
Yeah. And we all do. Have had Hopefully that's being corrected, but even today, we still have whatever degree. Now let's go on. In verse 10, wherefore, this is how God responded, I was grieved with that generation, and said, they do always err in their heart, they go astray in their heart, and here's our thing, they have not known my ways. Okay? So as a Bible student that you are now, you should be asking yourself, well, what are God's ways, right? If they don't know his ways, and that was part of what their demise and caused them to have to wander in the wilderness for so long, we should probably want to know what God's way is so we don't wander in the wilderness like many Christians are today. Living in fear, living in doubt, living in worry, living in all these things that God is not telling us to do. He said, I came that you might have life and that what? More abundantly. Fear, worry, all those things is not part of the abundant life. Okay? So, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 8. "40 years have passed, the children of Israel are getting ready to come into the promised land. Moses won't join them, only Joshua and Caleb, who was over the age of 20 when they left Egypt. Everyone over the age of 20 over the last 40 years, estimated 600,000 people have died. And they died in the wilderness because they didn't believe, they hardened their hearts, they didn't know God's way. Okay? So here we have a new generation, 2 generations, ready to enter the promised land. And God is, through Moses, giving them some very important instructions, and gang, you need to heed these instructions, okay? Because God hasn't changed. Somebody's cooking something. Ain't that tough? Verse 1. Someone read verse 1, please.
Every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land of which the Lord swore to your fathers.
Okay. Every word. Obey, right? Not just some of it. So that you can possess. That you can experience the promises that God has given. God promised them the whole land. Even today, and when they did go in, they only took a third of what God had promised them. Never had fully taken all that God had promised them. Anyway, listen carefully to verse 2 and 3. And thou shalt remember what? All what? All the what?
All the ways which...
That's right, all the way. We've heard that phrase, right? Here he's telling them to remember all the way. All the way what? Anybody? Just read it. That's all you got to do.
They were humbled and tested.
No, all the way which the Lord
thy God
led thee. Okay? Don't make the mistake that many people do. It wasn't Moses who led them out of Egypt. It wasn't Moses who led them to the Red Sea. It wasn't Moses who led them to where they didn't have any food. It wasn't Moses who led them to where they didn't have any water. It was the Lord. Okay? Moses was merely the instrument. And listen, gang, this is part of God's way. It's so important that you get this. Because without understanding it, there's no way you're going to accept it. And you're certainly not going to submit to it. So he's telling them, remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee he led them the whole 40 years. And why did he lead them? What was his intent? Look at verse 2. To humble them. They had been slaves for over 400 years. You'd think they'd be the most humble people in the world. No, they're just like you and me. We haven't been slaves of, well, we've been slaves to sin. But that's not in man's nature. Humility is not in man's nature. Proud, arrogant, stubborn, stiff-necked. That's man's nature. And so he led them his way. Well, let's see what his way is. He's going to tell us. Part of his way is to, what's the next thing? To test them.
Test.
That's God's way. I know that isn't what the message of the modern church is. It's a stroll down candy cane lane. But that's not God's way. And to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. Make sure you understand God already knew what was in their heart. They didn't know what was in their heart. And it's not until you go through a trial or a test that what's in your heart surfaces. And it's not pretty, is it?
Nope.
Not at all. But that's God's way. And why does God do that? To expose it so that we would see it and say, oh God, deliver me from this unbelief, this whatever sin it is. Make sense? That's God's way. Now, look at verse 3. And he humbled you and allowed you to hunger. Wow. Why would God do that? That's God's way. And he fed you with manna, which you didn't know of, neither did your fathers know. And this is it right here. This is the culmination. This is the desired end that God wants in your life by taking you down the path of his way. That you would know that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. That you would come to trust God and what he has said. And what he said, they're not two different things, are they? Trusting God, you trust in what he says, because what he said is his nature. It's who he is. And that is what you would trust. But what is God's way of bringing you to that place? What is it? Anybody?
Testing.
Testing, trials, difficulties, hardships. That's his way. Now, as I told you at the onset, this is part of his way. He also works through his word, revealing himself to us, right? And by his spirit. It's not just trial, right? He speaks to us. Let me take you don't need to turn there, but in Luke 22, Jesus says to Peter, you will deny me. Before the rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. That was God's word. And what did Peter do in response?